All right. So the key question, I think, is why do we call it genetic surgery? And there are a lot of things that it conjures, but fundamentally, we do surgery because it saves lives. Mimi, you're a former neurosurgeon. You understand this very, very directly. So if we imagine a situation in which, say, my daughter were born with a cardiac defect, an anatomical defect, it's a rare, life-threatening condition that requires urgent intervention. You would have a pediatric surgeon, a cardiologist, a whole team of physicians at a local hospital that evaluates the patients from birth, determines that individualized approach, but it's an approach that ultimately uses standard practices, tools that are just in the practice of medicine that are tailored towards the unique medical history, the anatomy, the desires of the parents and yeah, not in this case, not the baby themselves. But that is absolutely something that is just done today. And even for very, very complex things, like maybe my daughter might need a heart transplant, and um, you have organ sharing networks, you have data repository to suggest what is the right approach. And eventually, the clinician provides the intervention and the follow-up. Well, now what happens if you have a diagnosis like what we learned about for Terry's son, Michael, right? Here, we don't have that approach, even though a similar process nowadays can be followed with developing treatments. I think we've come a long way from small molecule drug development, where sometimes it feels a little bit like alchemy, where you modify something a little bit. It's very difficult to predict what will happen. We now have platform genetic medicines. What Terry articulated is gene replacement by AAV gene therapy. That is a platform. What I am working on is CRISPR genetic medicines with base and prime editing. What Tim has worked on is antisense oligos. These are all drugs that can be developed in a procedural way, just like how, a surgery is delivered. It's procedural, it's tailored to the individual patient, and more importantly, it's delivered to treat the patient in need that is presenting to you directly, not some theoretical, trial patient versus commercial patient, as they say in drug development. So this is what I propose that we need to build. And I also think that there are some analogies when we call it genetic surgery that are also important from regulators and payer perspectives. So first of all, we talked about everyone can imagine probably with these very, very specific gene editing, the molecular surgery is like we are operating on the genome. Sure. But there's business models, there's how the process is governed, and the regulatory models that are all in the practice already of surgery that we can borrow. So for example, in this case, a surgical center is financially sustainable and self-sufficient. A model already exists. The academics pay for the delivery of care, the time of the physicians, and they actually buy equipment and devices that are FDA approved to use in those therapies. The industry participants, the Medtronics, the Strykers who actually produce those FDA approved devices, they also build a viable business on top of that. Second, the governance of it. Surgeries are governed by professional societies with credentials, accreditation, and the institution, and it's not a very top-down. I mean, there could be very top-down approaches, but ultimately it is more of a local regulation with the judgment of a professional who cares as much about the patient as the family member and has years of training to do it. Then we have the regulatory involvement. So in this case, I mentioned that devices are approved by regulators for use in surgeries. Um, that can be the exact same mechanism where there are a set of technologies that can be approved and manufacturing processes approved for a given drug or a given treatment. And those can have very careful oversight by the government so that the data are logged and available for an audit, and that accreditation can be pulled if things are not up to standard. Lastly, the question of how do we learn, I think that is done by surgeons all the time, right? This idea of treatment with iterative learnings is a very important part of medicine where not everything needs a randomized controlled trial in order to progress medicine and to help people along the way. So that's the really that's it. That's what I wanted to propose as the idea. And I think if you have a health authority that sees the value of the longitudinal value of doing these surgeries early so that a patient and family is not um, incurring all the suffering and not to mention the medical expense of treatment, I think that is truly something that requires that high level innovation and vision, and that can be built by design with the appropriate team.